Hi, 8th graders. I'm going to read The Girl in the Green Sweater. I will be starting on page 211. There was the time our sewer workers came upon another windfall, a truckload of potatoes. It was winter, and there had been talk throughout Eastern Europe of a potato shortage. My father had read about it in the papers. This was of some concern to us because potatoes were a cheap staple of our diet. Sosha, too, was concerned. The more money he and his colleagues had to pay for our upkeep, the less they would have left over for themselves. And already Kowalow and Wróblewski were not happy that there was no longer any money. When Sosha came upon this truckload of potatoes, he thought he could get them down to the palace and save himself and Wróblewski the trouble of carting the small bags of potatoes they brought on a regular basis, as well as the money from not having to buy any potatoes for several weeks or more. He was alone at the time, and he located a manhole where he thought it would be dry underneath, and he set about dropping the potatoes into the sewer below. They were bundled in sacks, about 2 pounds each. After a while, a group of Germans came by and asked Sosha what he was doing. They were Germans in authority, probably SS or Gestapo. Sosha answered their concerns with authority of his own. One of the Germans stopped him and said, "Why are you throwing potatoes in the sewer?" Sosha said, "They're spoiled. I've been instructed to dispose of them." There was enough authority in Sosha's voice that the Germans left him alone to continue dumping the potatoes into the sewer. When he was finished, Sosha closed the manhole and made note of the location. With Kowalow's help, he drew a map for my father and the other men describing how to get to this place underground. And the next day my father went with Ohrenbach, Berestayke, and Korzars to collect the potatoes. There were too many to carry on one trip, so back and forth they went, back and forth, until all the potatoes were carried to the palace. Such a mountain of potatoes, maybe 50 or 60 pounds. We stored them in the space between our 2 benches and hoped we could eat our way through them before our friends the rats. There was this time little Paul slipped on a stone and hurt his leg so badly that it appeared certainly fractured. We did not have any plaster for a cast or any way to make a proper splint, so there was not much my worried parents could do for him. Sosha could not attempt to procure such supplies or fill any prescriptions for pain medication without attracting attention, so Paul could only sit still for several weeks until the bone could heal. My father would carry him to the chamber pot whenever he had to go. Luckily, Paul was young and in otherwise good health, and the bone healed quickly. There was the time when a small fire enveloped our close space and nearly accomplished what the Germans could not. Weinbergova was cooking our daily soup when suddenly the Primus stove tipped over and the fire erupted. And it was not just a small kitchen fire, but an open, roaring flame. The benzene used to light the stove had spilled, so the fire spread. It happened in an instant, and soon it looked like a raging fireball, which was especially dangerous in our tiny chamber. There was nowhere for the group of us to go. We would have been incinerated or suffocated if it were not for the swift action of our group. Immediately, Korzars and my father threw blankets on the flames and tried to extinguish the fire. Their efforts were not terribly successful, for one of the blankets caught flame and caught fire itself. Then one of the men determined that our store of used carbide powder would be a good way to smother the fire. All along we'd been emptying the used powder in a pile at the far end of our chamber, and the men scooped this up and threw it on the flames. It proved effective. At the same time, my mother and Clara covered the small opening that led to the street, thinking only to prevent the smoke from escaping and giving away our location. But this action had the unanticipated effect of closing off a source of oxygen to this chamber and making it difficult for the fire to breathe. Both courses of action, taken together, allowed us to put out the fire, but not before we experienced some difficulty breathing ourselves. Our hair and eyelashes were all singed from the flames, our faces blackened from ash and soot, our routines momentarily upset by the chaos we experienced until the fire was under control. When Sosha and Wróblewski arrived the next day, they could not believe what had happened. They commended us for our heroics and our cleverness in extinguishing the flame, only there had not seemed much of either on display during the 10 or 15 minutes it took for the fire to be stilled. Really, it was more like a series of desperate measures that happened to do the job before we were done in by the flames. Then there was the time, almost 7 months into our confinement, when we celebrated Christmas with Sosha and Wróblewski. Sosha had been talking about this for some months. He felt that since he celebrated our Jewish New Year with us, we should in turn celebrate this holiday with him. I cannot imagine how Sosha and Wroblewski managed to separate from their families on Christmas, on such an important holiday, but they passed most of Christmas morning and much of the afternoon in our company. They brought vodka and sandwiches and a festive mood. My father was worried that Sosha and Wroblewski would drink too much and become talkative once they returned to the outside and give away our location. My father did not drink, but on this occasion he pretended to do so. He kept filling his glass and spilling the vodka into the mud, and in this way he hoped there would be less vodka for our sewer workers to consume. We learned later that Sosha was also worried about Wroblewski. Always when the two men retired at the end of each day, Wroblewski suggested they stop for a drink before heading home. Sosha worried. He trusted his colleagues implicitly to keep their secret, but he did not trust them under the influence of alcohol. He did not trust himself under the influence of alcohol either, and so determined not to drink beyond a social glass or two as long as we were in his care. There were birthday and anniversary celebrations too, but of course there was no real cause for celebration, merely gratification that we had survived another milestone under the brutal Nazi regime in such inhospitable conditions. Sosha in particular made a grand show for my mother's birthday. He very much admired my mother, the way she cared for us two chicks, the way she cared for Bobsia and the other women in our group, the way she shouldered our hardships with grace and composure. Once again he brought vodka, and once again my father pretended to drink more than his share, to keep as much alcohol from the lips of our visitors as possible. For these special occasions, my father would prepare a performance of some kind. He wrote plays and satires and new lyrics to popular songs. He was very clever in this way. His satires were comedies about the individuals in our group, and we used to laugh so hard at how we appeared in the others' eyes. His songs were clever pieces of wordplay that often poked fun at our own characters and at our struggles at the hands of the Germans. We were not so desperate, he believed, that we could not laugh at our situation. Helena was also clever with words, and she contributed some poems and satires of her own. The L of our chamber would be off stage, and this is where we would go to prepare our scenes. There was not a lot for us to be excited about in the monotony of our underground work, so we came to enjoy the preparations as performances. There would be a part for everyone who wanted to participate. Not everyone wanted to participate. Genia Weinberg and Chas Ohrenbach, as I recall, would not take a part. They considered it a waste of time to stage these little plays for Sosha and Wroblewski, but doing so reminded us of how we were still a civilized group, that we could be creative and productive, that we were human beings after all. We came to look forward to these performances, the sewer workers too. I would look up from practicing my letters and see my father busy scribbling in the 1938 pocket diary Sosha had brought him just for this purpose, and know that a new satire was soon coming. These aberrations from routine were life itself. Indeed, the most dramatic of these came in the form of a birth and two deaths. The birth, of course, was the inevitable result of Weinbergova's secret pregnancy, which was not such a secret as our time underground continued. Still, Sosha did not know of her condition until the very end. We had to put off telling him for so long that it was now thought best to wait until the last possible moment. Finally, after my mother and father took Sosha aside to explain the matter, at first my parents reported Sosha was shocked. He thought back to the difficulties of the past month and wondered how a pregnant woman could endure such hardships. Then he wondered how a baby could be safely delivered in such unsanitary conditions, and after that there was the greater worry about how to care for the baby and keep its certain cries from being heard above ground. Surely the activity of a healthy baby over a prolonged period would lead to our discovery. This was a big dilemma, everyone agreed, but no one could offer a good solution to any of the problems the pregnancy presented. Finally, Sosha threw up his hands and said, "We will have to think about what to do." But Weinbergova could not wait for Sosha to develop a plan. She went into labor shortly after this encounter. Genia was moved into the private corner of our chamber. I remained with Paul and a few others in the main part of our chamber. I did not know exactly what was happening, only that something was happening. I was nearly 8 years old, but despite the maturity and wisdom that had been forced upon me by our circumstances, I was still innocent of things such as childbirth. I would piece together the particulars later. My father acted as midwife. My mother and some of the other women frantically boiled water. There was a good deal of rummaging through some of the things for a suitable blanket or a piece of cloth. This, too, I remember. There was a low moaning of Weinbergova. This I remember most of all. As I listened to Genia's moaning, I felt so terribly frightened for her. I did not know what could cause such pain, such anguish. I could not even imagine. She must have been so afraid. Regarding the details of Genia Weinberg's delivery, I can only share what my parents shared with me afterward. After the birth, my father cut the umbilical cord with a pair of rusty scissors. The baby, I learned later, was a boy. Bobsia collected the newborn from my father and tended to him while my mother prepared a mixture of warm sugar water to get the child to nurse. After a while, the baby was placed along Genia's outstretched body on one of the planks we used for sleeping. My mother said Genia appeared to agonize over her natural maternal instincts to protect and nurture this child and our unnatural circumstances that cast this infant as a threat to our survival. No one knew whether to welcome this child or to fear his arrival, not even Weinbergova. It was an anxious time in our part of the chamber. Even Paul was nervous. He did not understand the commotion all around. He did not understand the sound of the baby crying. "This is a baby, Krisha?" he asked me at one point. I could not think how to answer. Meanwhile, outside, Sosha was just as anxious. He spent the time since learning of Weinbergova's condition trying to find a home for the baby that was about to be born in our underground family. He did not know that Weinbergova was now in labor, and we did not know he was making these inquiries on the child's behalf. Sosha knew only the baby was coming, probably soon, and he went to church after church, trying to find a group of nuns that would care for the newborn child without asking any questions. Finally, he located such a church, such a group of nuns, and he could not wait to return to our chamber the following morning to deliver this welcome news. Weinbergova passed an uncertain few hours with her newborn baby pressed to her side, not knowing what Sosha had arranged. She only knew that with each cry, her baby threatened to give us all away, and that the baby's chances of survival in our dark, damp hovel would not be good. My mother sat with them and watched as Genia moved closer and closer to the child. Genia kept covering the baby's face with a rag, and at first it seemed this was merely to quiet the sound of his whimpering, but then it became clear she was attempting to suffocate the baby and put an end to the uncertainty. My mother gently pushed the rag away from the infant's face, and then a few moments later, at the next sound of whimpering, Genia returned with the rag, and my mother gently pushed it aside again. All of this happened without any words passing between the two women. Their eyes did all of the talking. Back and forth they went like this as everyone else drifted off to sleep. It had been a long, eventful night. My mother stayed up with Genia for as long as she could, stroking her hair, pushing her hands from the baby's face, but eventually she drifted off too. And it was at this moment Genia determined to smother her newborn baby, to sacrifice the one whose chances were slim for the good of the others, whose chances were only a little bit slimmer than slim. My mother always felt guilty she had fallen asleep at such a critical time. She was crestfallen when she awoke and realized what Weinbergova had done. We were all upset about this, but my mother most of all. She thought that if she had stayed awake, the baby might have been spared. Perhaps this was so, but my mother was not to blame. No one was to blame. Also, just at that moment, no one in our group could say that Weinbergova's decision was not for the best. Our underground chamber was no environment for an infant. His constant cries would have placed us in danger. Because of this, it was possible to look on this sad development as an act of great courage on the part of Genia Weinberg. Only it did not appear so a little bit later that morning when Sosha arrived in our chamber with what he thought would be welcome news. Such a tragic moment, Such a cruel irony for Weinbergova to learn that her baby might have been spared after all, that Sosha had made arrangements for the baby to be raised by nuns to have a chance at a full and happy life. It was the situation she had chosen for her young daughter when Weinbergova had the opportunity to place her with an Aryan family to escape the liquidation, and it was the situation she would have chosen for her infant son if only she had known such a situation was possible. Poor Genia Weinberg was inconsolable, and she would remain so for the next while. For the next few days she kept to the elbow of the L in relative privacy. She would not speak, she would not eat. She was weakened from childbirth, so this contributed to her distant mood, but she was also broken by what now she regarded as the unnecessary death of her infant child. Gradually, however, she returned to her routines. She resumed her responsibilities with the cooking. She joined us when we were sitting and talking. She was not the same, of course, but she was back once again to the business of surviving, to making the best of what was left for her. The second death, sadly, was Bobsia's. In the end, the horrible conditions in the sewer became too much for old Mrs. Weiss, and she died in her sleep one night. She was asthmatic, and the dampness of the underground air was not helping her condition. Her breathing was becoming worse and worse. We could hear her wheezing all night long. Each day it was a little more difficult for her to move. My mother had to help her. When it was her turn for a bath, my mother checked her each day for lice after she was through checking us children. My mother was at her side at the very end, holding her hand, and in the morning the men wrapped Bobsia's body and waited for Sosha and Wrobleski to arrive and determine what they should do next. Sosha was very superstitious. He did not want to be in our small chamber with a dead body. He told us what to do, and then he left. Wrobleski, too. He was not so superstitious, but he would not stay without Sosha. Veresteike said the prayers. I can still picture him in his flowing talith, chanting the mourner's Kaddish. Some of the other adults said a few words of remembrance. We all shed a few tears. Next, the men pushed Bobsia's body into the narrow pipe opening and through the pipe where it opened by the main canal. In this way, they carried her to the Peltu. There they said another few prayers and buried her body in the river. Then the men returned to the palace and to the rest of their lives. There was no traditional period of mourning for old Mrs. Weiss, just as there had been no traditional period of mourning for Weinbergova's baby, or my Uncle Kuba, or the others of our group who had been shot and killed upon leaving the sewer. We did not sit Shiva. Every day for us was Shiva, so we said our few prayers and shared our few thoughts and continued on. For the longest time, we had been a group of 11. For the briefest time, we were a group of 12. Now we were 10, and I began to worry that this was the start of some new heartbreaking pattern, that one by one we would take turns leaving, that soon would be just my immediate family, and after that we would be no more. I will read Chapter 8 starting tonight, everybody. Happy listening.